auditors, controllers, and treasurers. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on NSAA's peer review program, What to Know Before You Go. My name is Kenny Pointer, and I'm the Executive Director of NSAA, and I'll be serving as your host for today's event. We're joined today by staff in approximately 38 different NSAA member offices and includes 300 individuals located across the United States. As everyone knows, government auditing standards require audit organizations to participate in an external quality control review program. Since the mid-1980s, the National State Auditors Association has helped state audit organizations comply with this standard and improve their overall audit quality through its peer review program. Today's webinar will provide an overview of the items that you need to know in preparing for and conducting an NSAA peer review. Specific topics that we will cover today include such things as a general overview, objectives, and general considerations of a peer review, the organization and qualifications of the peer review team, performing peer reviews, including guidance on the preliminary phase, the fieldwork phase, as well as the completion phase. Also, finalizing the peer review, including determining what type of report that a peer review team should issue. And lastly, but perhaps most importantly, tips and insights on how to conduct an effective review. We're very fortunate to have with us today NSAA Peer Review Committee members Brad Blake. Brad is the Chief Auditor for the Center of Audit Excellence, Ohio Auditor of State. John Buyce. John is the Director of State Audits, New York Office of the Controller. Greg Fugate, Performance Auditor, Performance Audit Manager, Colorado Office of the State Auditor. And lastly, Staci Henshaw, Deputy Auditor, Virginia Office of the Public Accounts. More information on all of our speakers can be found in their bios, which were included in the materials and instructions that were emailed to you previously. Following the presentation today, we will have approximately 25 minutes for live questions and answers. Today, we are allowing participants to receive audio through either their computer or their phone. And to ask your question, please use the raise your hand function of our webinar software. Simply click on the hand icon located in the toolbar. If you are asking your question using your computer, please note that your computer must have a microphone for that process to work properly. Now, if you prefer, you can just type your question and send it to us by using the Questions tab, also located in the webinar toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen. Our speakers today will be using a PowerPoint presentation, which you should be able to see on your screen and was provided to you in advance. If you're having any technical difficulties at all, please give us a call. Our number here is 859-276-1147. Again, that number is 859-276-1147. As you can tell, we have a very full agenda today. I want to express my gratitude to our speakers for taking time from their busy schedules to be with us today. And with that as a brief background, let me now turn the program over to our speakers. Brad, Greg, John, and Staci, welcome to today's webinar. And Brad, I think you're going to lead us off.
Okay. I'm starting with an overview of the process, and let me click on my slides here 1 second. Okay, hopefully you can see all the slides now. The purpose of the peer review is really an independent assessment of an audit organization's policies and procedures. What the review team will do is they will evaluate the design of your policies and procedures through an extensive checklist process, and they will also determine whether or not that design of your policies and procedures are adequate to adhere to the standards, and then they'll test a selection of reports which are issued to see whether or not the design which is documented is the process that your audit organization follows. So it's really two phases. One is an evaluation of your policies and procedures, and the other is whether or not those policies and procedures are followed. The end result is an opinion will be issued, and the opinion will say whether or not your process is appropriate to complete audits in accordance with the standards. Additionally, a quick overview, the Yellow Book began in 1989. That required peer reviews. NSAA, prior to that, had a peer review process in place starting in 1985. And currently there are around the country 54 organizations which are eligible to participate in the program. You might say, 54, that's an odd number. Multiple states have, or some states have multiple organizations within their state which qualifies to perform peer reviews. I thought it might be some things like Puerto Rico or Samoa, those sorts of places, but it's not. It's the 50 states, and as I say, some states have multiple qualifying organizations. The responsibility for the peer review process is the audit committee within NSAA, and that's made up of people from around the country. And they're responsible for designing the process, the peer review process, the guidelines, maintaining some of the guidelines relative to the checklist and things of that sort. Also, during the process, if a dispute between adherence with standards comes up, the peer review committee helps resolve some of the questions about applicability of standards or interpretation of the standards and how ultimately a review team would find what their findings are and how someone would the impact on the opinion. And they also coordinate, the peer review committee also coordinates with other organizations relative to the peer review process. The role at NASDAQ is really one of an administrator. They keep files from prior years and maintain a time bank relative to people's time that they put in and the time spent on reviews. They also assign the review teams, and I think later on we'll talk a little bit that the review teams are approved by the organizations, but they help coordinate that process. And they train review members, this being part of the process of helping to train some of the members about what to expect. Also, they update the policies and procedures for conducting a peer review in accordance with the standards. Ultimately, the objective of the review is that evaluation of a state's system of quality control. And as I say, it's an opinion relative to what I think of as their process, if you will. It's not an opinion on whether or not the engagement selected necessarily adhere with the standards. It's whether or not overall an entity's process is one that can conduct audits appropriately and whether or not they are adhering with their policies and procedures. They evaluate whether or not the states adequately documented and communicated their findings, whether or not basically reasonable assurance about compliance with the Yellow Book standards is ultimately the goal. In the completion phase of the review, ultimately it's to issue that report. That is really the ultimate goal, a report with an opinion on it. And there's three types of reports that are issued. One is a pass, which maybe in financial terms is like getting an unmodified report. Pass with deficiencies, which is that you're adhering to the standards, but there are a few areas of concern that the team would like to bring to the audit organization's attention. And then there's a fail potential as well. And the fact that the audit organization's design or application of their policies and procedures may not necessarily adhere to the standards. Some general considerations about NSAA. When you're a team member and when you're part of a team, one of maintaining confidentiality. And NSAA certainly has a process to maintain confidentiality about the work papers and the process itself. Also, look to be independent of the state organization you might be assigned to. One of the ways in which that's accomplished, at least from a documentation standpoint, is when you go out as a team member or a team leader, a concurring reviewer, there's an independent statement that you sign, which fundamentally acknowledges that you have no biases towards the organization you'll be reviewing, and NSAA maintains those independent statements in their work papers. And also that the team and the individuals assigned to it possess knowledge about the process, what the goals are ultimately, and and about the work papers that they'll be looking at and the policies they'll be evaluating. Some ways of gaining proficiency at that is training such as this, actually doing a review as a team member and training a little bit from your team leader, and our concurring reviewer could also have some input relative to that as well. Okay, moving on to the organization, the qualifications of the review team. A review team is made up of 3 different types of reviewers. There's multiple team members on any review, but there's always a concurring reviewer, and that's the person with the most experience relative to a review team. That's a person that would have gone out before as a team member, gone out before as a team leader, and been on multiple reviews in effect, and someone that's kind of seen the ins and outs of the progress of the process. That's really the most senior member of the team, and they help the team in effect come to some conclusion about what type of opinion is appropriate based on the documentation and the evaluation provided by the state audit organization. There's a team leader. That's the person that's responsible, if you will, for the day-to-day operations of the review. They're the ones that they're the person that would be assigning different tasks within the review process and making sure that the checklists are appropriately filled out and that any potential issues of concern are adequately explored and documented, and resolution is appropriate based on really their experience and the experience of the people doing the review as well, people looking at the work papers and whatnot. But overall, they've got the responsibility for planning the review, selecting engagements, and deciding what the scope of the review in terms of number of engagements selected as appropriate for the state audit organization. And there's team members. Those are people responsible for reviewing work papers or reviewing specific policies assigned by the team members. So you may look at reporting as a function. You may look at the quality control function. You may look at different aspects of the review, things like CP and whatnot. And those are the people that do some of the tasks during the week of review. Okay, a typical review is made up of a team leader, and that team leader and the concurring reviewer, about 4 or 5 months in advance of the actual review, they're selected in conjunction with a state audit organization. NSAA will select a couple people, and they'll also identify some team members to go as well. The identification of who's appropriate has to do and is tailored to the state audit organization itself relative to if an entity primarily does performance audits, well, they'll send a lot of people out with performance audit experience. If there's a mixture, they'll try and get a team that has a mixture of performance and financial audit or what is appropriate for the state audit organization. Generally, as I say, the team leader selected 4 or 5 months out, and the team members a couple months, 2-3 months before the commencement of the review on site. Qualifications for a concurring reviewer. Really, that's someone that has been a team leader before. Often a concurring reviewer is someone that's been out as a team leader a couple of times in the past, and they become a concurring reviewer at the recommendation, once they serve as a team leader, at the recommendation of the concurring reviewers they've been out with in the past. And so there's an evaluation at the end of each review where people's performance are looked at and some recommendation as to whether or not they would make an appropriate concurring reviewer. And once they've been selected, then they serve in that role often many times. As for a team leader, that's someone that would have served as a team member at least one time in the past. It's not uncommon to have team leaders that have been out a number of times before they're selected to be a team leader. And a team member that's been selected to be a team leader, they are put forward at the evaluation of prior team leaders and prior concurring reviewers. And right. Qualifications to be a team member, someone that is recommended from the audit organizations themselves. So the head of the audit organization will send to NSAA every year a list of people that they would like considered to go out on peer reviews. They have to be people with extensive supervisory and managerial responsibilities relative to audit engagements. They have to be people that review audits as a course of their normal job duties. And they also have to have a minimum of 3 years in the supervisory capacity in order to qualify as a team member. A few other items. When a team is selected, NSAA will take the team and really try to match the skills of the team with the needs of the audit organization. So they'll look again at the type of work performed, whether it's financial performance, perhaps a test. They'll look at the size of the organization. They'll look at what organizations, like the Government Audit Quality Center, they participate in, and try to match up the needs of the entity with the needs of the team, and try not to get too many of one type of reviewer, whether they might be financial or performance. Try not to get too many of one type on a team. If like in our state, about half of our work or half of our reviewers are people with financial experience, then we usually have a federal reviewer, often have had, and then we'll have a handful of performance reviewers, because a lot of our work is financial related, and so they try to match the team up in Ohio with our needs. Often 6 reviewers are selected, but that's not necessarily a magic number. That's pretty common. On larger states, more people go out if a larger number of audits are anticipated to be selected. On some smaller states, I've been on reviews as small as 1 team leader, 1 concurring reviewer, and 1 team member, and usually the 3 share responsibilities for evaluating the policies and procedures and performing some of the review. But for larger engagement, a concurring reviewer could be solely responsible for just, if you will, evaluating the work and signing off to make sure the process has been followed. So 6 is common, but not absolutely. With that, I've come to the end of my part of the presentation, and I think we're turning it over to Greg Fugate.
Great, thanks, Brad. Hang on just a second while I share my screen. All right, so hopefully we're up and running. Good day, everyone. We're now going to actually turn into the process of performing the peer review. And so this is the bulk of the presentation today, is really walking you through the 3 phases of the peer review process. And so as Kenny mentioned at the start, we have a preliminary phase, a fieldwork phase, and a completion phase. And all of the reviews are, again, conducted in accordance with the policies and procedures developed by the NSAA Review Committee and approved by the NSAA membership. And all of the materials are available through to members through NASAC's website. So that's a place you can go to download all of these materials. I'm going to walk through the activities in the preliminary phase, which generally encompasses all planning and work activities that occur prior to the team's arrival on site at the state offices. Work for a peer review starts 4 to 5, sometimes 6 months before the team arrives on site for the review. And a lot of the work during this phase is completed by the team leader and the concurring reviewer. However, team members also have responsibilities during the preliminary phase, and I'll go through those a little bit later. In terms of an overview of the preliminary phase, this phase of the peer review is really geared to help members of the team gain an understanding of the review process, review preliminary documentation from the state, and survey a sample of staff, determine the scope of the review and select audit engagements for review, and to finalize other administrative logistics as well. Now, there are a number of documents that are used during the peer review, and again, all of these are available to members through NASAC's website. But these standard documents are really there to help ensure a thorough and consistent review. The Audit Organization Questionnaire is completed by the state. The Audit Staff Questionnaire gets completed by a sample of staff from the state. The Policies and Procedures Review Guides get completed by both the state and the peer review team. The Audit Engagement Review Guides get completed by the peer review team. And finally, the Matters for Further Consideration, Findings for Further Consideration, and Conclusions documents get completed by the peer review team. And we'll go through all of these documents in more detail throughout the course of our presentation. If you are participating on a peer review team, the first thing you should do is familiarize yourself with the process. Go read the peer review manual. It's a large manual, but it contains everything that you need to know. In particular, one section provides answers to common questions that review team members may have. In addition to explaining the review process and the documents used during the review, the peer review manual also describes administrative procedures such as travel arrangements, reimbursement of expenses, and other logistics that are always a frequent source of questions. Okay, so let's get into the things the team leader is doing at this early stage of the review. Once the team leader has been selected for the review, NSAA will send him or her the prior work papers. And the work papers include everything from the state's prior review, with the exception of the staff survey responses and checklists for the individual audit engagements reviewed. By looking at these work papers, the team leader gets a sense of the issues, if any, that were identified during the prior review, and these could be indicators of areas to look at and follow up on in the current year's review. One of the first documents that the state provides the team leader is the Audit Organization Questionnaire. And this gets completed about 12 weeks prior to the review. And it's an important key document for the review because it provides the population of audits and related audit hours within the review period. And this document also provides information about the state office's staff, its structure, statutes, its quality control system, and so on. The team leader will rely on the information in this document to make some decisions about which audits to select for review, which staff to sample for the questionnaire, and those types of things. So based on the review of the prior work papers and information from the Audit Organization Questionnaire, the team leader works with the state to determine the scope of the review. And as a team leader, you're looking at what types of engagements the state office performs and how many. It's important to note here that the scope of the peer review only covers engagements that the state office states were performed in accordance with government auditing standards. The scope of the review covers a one-year period that is agreed upon by the state and the review team. And this one-year period might be a calendar year, a fiscal year, or some other relevant one-year period to the state organization. And the review covers the GAGAS reports issued and the related quality control policies and procedures that were in effect during the one-year period. And finally, it's important to know what areas the peer review does not cover. Specifically, the review does not cover non-GAGAS engagements or audits that the state office may have contracted with an outside entity, such as a private CPA firm, to perform. The review also doesn't cover the efficiency of the audit process or compliance with state statutes or general administrative policies and procedures, unless those policies and procedures are relied upon to ensure compliance with applicable auditing standards. So, for example, you might have administrative policies and procedures that help the state staff maintain their CPE records and documentation, or independence, those types of things. The peer review would cover those types of policies and procedures. So during this initial stage of the review, the team leader is also taking care of some administrative logistics, such as preparing and sending an engagement letter to the state and setting a calendar for the review, including deadlines for receiving key documents. The team leader is also communicating about the review with the concurring reviewer and, once assigned, the remaining members of the review team. Once the contract for the peer review is fully executed, NSAA will provide a copy of that to the team leader. And so for those team leaders out there, you don't have to worry about remembering all of these items. There is a team leader work program in the peer review manual that walks you through all of these steps and keeps you organized. So that's a good checklist to look at if you're a team leader or aspiring to be a team leader. Okay. So now I'd like to go a little more in depth on some of the key items that you see listed here that are completed during this phase of the review. And again, I want to remind you that this is all work that's completed prior to your arrival on site at the state offices. One of the most important things that happens during the preliminary phase is that the team leader, with the agreement of the concurring reviewer, selects those audit engagements that will be examined in depth during the fieldwork phase of the review. So as a team leader, you'll start with the population of all audits issued during the one-year review period. And remember that the state provides this information to you as part of the audit organization questionnaire. When selecting the sample of audits for review, you'll consider a number of factors to try and ensure reasonable coverage. So you might look to ensure that you have audits that span the entire review period. For example, you wouldn't necessarily want to pick all of your audits from the last 2 months of the review period. You might also want to choose audits overseen by different supervisors or audits that represent a significant portion of the total audit hours in the review period. Obviously, your sample should include representation of the different types of GAGAS engagements the state conducts. And finally, you should select one surprise audit, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So again, you're focusing on how are we going to get reasonable, what audits are we going to look at to help us gain reasonable assurance that the state is complying with its system of quality control. Also, during the preliminary phase, the team leader will select a sample of staff to complete the audit staff questionnaire. And this should be a sample of audit staff who perform work on GAGAS engagements. Be sure to exclude administrative staff and other non-audit personnel before selecting your sample. And the team leader may also use this same list of sampled staff as the basis for the on-site review of compliance with CPE requirements and independence requirements. So let's talk a little bit about the audit staff questionnaire, another key document during the review. The questionnaire is administered to a sample of audit staff about 8 weeks prior to the review, and staff submit their completed questionnaires directly to the team leader. As a team leader, you'll compile the responses and communicate a summary to the rest of the review team. And basically, this questionnaire helps the review team identify potential areas of focus for the review. Depending on the pattern of responses, the questionnaire can indicate areas where staff's understanding of the system of quality control and therefore adherence to applicable auditing standards may be lacking or need some attention. Again, this is a planning tool for the review team. One of the other things that the team leader and concurring reviewer will discuss is the need for a preliminary site visit. Since most states have been in the peer review program for a number of years, preliminary visits are normally not necessary. However, for states that are being reviewed under the peer review program for the first time, a preliminary site visit should be considered. In addition, when the prior peer review rating was passed with deficiencies or fail, or if major changes have occurred in the organization, such as new types of audits or a new organizational structure, you may also want to consider a preliminary site visit in those situations. If a preliminary site visit is warranted, this would occur about 4 to 6 weeks in advance of the review. Instead of a preliminary site visit, one common approach is for the team leader to arrive on site at the state's offices 1 to 2 days prior to the rest of the review team. Generally, this can help the team leader ensure everything is ready for the review and also take care of reviewing CPE and independence documentation. This option is something that I've used on my reviews, and it is something I recommend that team leaders consider and discuss with the concurring reviewer and the state. In some situations, it can really help the review run more smoothly. One of the Other key documents I mentioned earlier is the Policy and Procedures Review Checklist. These are, I think, everybody's favorite part of the review. The document, the checklist, these documents help the review team understand the state office's policies and procedures and how they relate to the applicable professional standards. I like to think of these checklists as a crosswalk from the standards to the state's system of quality control. And this document helps the review team, again, understand the design of the state office's system of quality control. The Policies and Procedures Review Checklist has a section that first gets completed by the state and is then given to the team leader along with a copy of the state's policies and procedures about 8 weeks prior to the review. And so the Policy and Procedures Review Checklist looks like this, or at least one page of the checklist looks like this. And there are separate checklists for financial audits, performance audits, and attestation engagements. And the checklists are generally organized by audit standards. During the preliminary phase of the review, the team leader will assign each team member all or a section of the Policy and Procedures Review Checklist to complete. And the team members will also be provided a copy of the state's policies and procedures. As a team member, you'll use the checklist to review the state's policies and procedures in your assigned areas. Now, the general advice that I have for teams is to remember that not every office approaches its policies and procedures in the same manner. Some offices may have a detailed policy and procedure manual that covers everything. Other offices may have policy manuals that establish the broad standards and expectations, but then rely on standard audit programs or checklists to cover the specifics. And so you'll need to use your judgment when completing these review checklists. As a team member, you may have some limited follow-up with state office staff about their policies and procedures that needs to be done when you arrive on site for the review. But you should be substantially completed with your assigned sections of the policies and procedures checklists before arriving on site for the review. I will say that delays by team members in completing their pre-visit work assignments affect the team's ability to complete its on-site work. And ultimately, this affects the quality of the review, and it can make for some long days and nights for the review team. I will also say for states that are out there that are preparing for a peer review, making sure that you're meeting the agreed upon deadlines for completing these checklists is also important to allow the team to complete its pre-visit work and therefore be prepared for the on-site review. So everybody kind of needs to be working together in order to have a successful review. Finally, John will talk more about the matters for further consideration, or MFC form, in a little bit. But for any items marked no on the Policy and Procedures Review Checklist, you must also write up a corresponding MFC. Again, John will talk more about what that means. During the preliminary phase, the team leader should discuss the overall plan for the review, such as which audit engagements to sample, work assignments, and so forth, and obtain agreement with the concurring reviewer. About 4 to 6 weeks prior to the review, the team leader should let the state office know which audit engagements have been selected for review. However, the state should be informed about the surprise audit only once the team arrives on site. So that's the only audit that you shouldn't give the state advance notice of. When making work assignments for the team leader will also assign each member one or more audit engagements for review using the Audit Engagement Review Checklist. And John will talk more about this checklist, but I want to mention it briefly here because there are some sections on this checklist related to reporting standards that team members may be able to complete before arriving on site for the review. So if you can do that, I recommend doing so. But at a minimum, before arriving on site, you should download and familiarize yourself with the reports for those audits whose work papers you'll be reviewing. It gives you just a little bit more familiarity and knowledge about the findings, the reporting conditions that you will see in the work papers. And so here's just an example of what one page of the Audit Engagement Review Guide looks like. Again, another checklist. And then finally, about 1 to 2 weeks prior to the review, the team leader will communicate with the team members and confirm a number of administrative logistics, such as dress code, travel arrangements, meeting locations, the general schedule for the week, those types of things. And as I wrap up, I want to say that there are a lot of moving parts to planning a peer review. But there are also a lot of resources available to team leaders, team members, and state offices preparing for their review. If something is unclear or if you have questions, give Kathleen or Sherry at NASDAQ a call. But also don't forget to look in the peer review manual. Again, that's a comprehensive guide from the NSAA Peer Review Committee about the peer review process. And so that finishes my discussion of the preliminary phase of the review, and I'd like to pass things over to John.
John, are you with us?
Thanks, Greg. I'm sorry, I still had the mute stuff going. Thanks a lot. Hopefully after that, everybody's got a really good idea now of exactly what they should expect to happen before they get on site to do a review. So now let's spend a little time and try to talk about what happens after you arrive in the capital city. There's still going to be several major things left that need to be completed. You're going to start with finishing up your review of that policy and procedure guide that Greg was showing us. Any kind of substantive testing or anything that needs to be done as a result of that. You're also going to start testing compliance with those items through your review of those actual audits. And you're going to end up coming together and getting some overall conclusion about what you found and having an exit conference with the state audit folks. So in this section, what I'm going to try to do is walk you through a little bit of what your week is going to look like. As you can see from the chart up there, first of all, there's generally two kinds of reviews. There's short ones and there's long ones. In either case, we try not to keep you away over more than one weekend, though, if you're serving on a team. As Greg was saying, the 5-day reviews generally run Monday through Friday. The 10-day reviews may either run on a Monday to Wednesday schedule, or if you would start a review on a Wednesday and go home on the following Friday. The only real difference there is that these longer ones allow you a few more days to be able to go and review the sampled audits. And that's primarily driven by the size of the audit shop, the number of people that are working there, the number of audits they produce during the year, et cetera. The bigger ones just seem to take longer to do. That's all there is to it, especially if we're trying to get some kind of significant amount of coverage for all the audit hours that are being produced. And as you also heard from Greg, past performance can play into this decision as well. Organizations that have had some issues in the past might take a little longer to do, as may organizations that are brand new to the program and have never gone through a peer review. But really, when you think about it, none of that is any different than the regular audits that all of us do every day, right? So here's what that longer review looks like. Now, this chart comes out of NSAA's peer review manual, which, as Brad was saying, is available online, and also you probably have a state coordinator who has a copy of it right at home that you could take a look at. But as you can see, the initial time during the review is spent trying to tie up the loose ends from the control evaluations, filling out that policy and procedure guide. You're getting some clarifications on things you didn't understand, or getting pointed to things in an audit manual that you weren't actually able to find yourself, and being able to finish up that whole checklist and have that done. Then after that, you're going to move into testing the audit engagements, summarizing up the work, and starting to combine that with the work that's been done with everybody else on the team. Finally, as you get towards the end of it, you're evaluating those collective results, and you're really trying to all get together and decide what kind of opinion you're going to issue. And then finally, you'll draft up a report, hold an exit conference, and hopefully head your way for home. Small reviews. Here's the 5-day line. As you can see, it's about the same. There's just a little less time there in the middle for you to do the testing. And that's primarily because there's usually less audits to consider when you're doing a small review. By this point, I'm probably boring the financial auditors to death because this sounds a lot like the process that all of you use every single day to conduct the normal financial audit, right? I mean, you go in there, you just try to understand and evaluate internal controls. You then do some tests of compliance. You perform some substantive tests. You sit down at the end, you evaluate materiality, and you write a report, and then you head for home. So let's try to be a little more specific, I guess, try to walk our way through a day in the life of a peer reviewer, I guess. Or, well, actually, in our case, it's a week, but here we go. Let's see what it looks like. So the first thing that happens is the day that you show up. And again, a 5-day review is usually a Sunday. It could be a Sunday or maybe even a Tuesday if you're on a long review. But most folks generally come in there the day before the review starts. So team leaders at that point often hold that team meeting that we were talking about at the hotel in the evening before the review starts. Okay, this is a good chance for you to get to know the rest of the reviewers that are there on the team, and also to let them know about any issues, any kind of concerns that you might have after reviewing the section of the policies that you've had responsibility for. It's also a good time to talk about the results of the staff surveys that have been done, and if there's any comments that have come in that raise some concerns that make any of you want to look for something specific. The important part here is to remember you've only looked at a piece or two of these policies and procedures, and so have all the rest of the folks on the team. So if there's things that you think that they need to be on the lookout for when they're going through sampled audits, you need to let them know that. And at the same point in time, you need to listen up for areas where you might want to pay some special attention as you go through the audits that have been assigned to you. Now, as we said before, sometimes the logistics don't all come together right, and the teams might do this through a conference call. Frequently when we set up travel arrangements with folks coming from all over the country, you just don't get everybody in at a decent hour to be able to have a meeting on the day before. If that happens, it's usually going to occur sometime during the week before you folks head out for the review. You'll sit together, you do this on a conference call or a video conference and go through all the same things. Now, when you wake up the next morning on the first day, time to get started. You're going to head your way off to the state auditor's office, get yourself settled in there. Like with any other audit that you're used to doing, you'll have a short entrance conference at the beginning. The folks from the state audit office will tell you how happy they are to have you there, and you'll agree and tell them how wonderful it is to be in their beautiful state capital. And then at that point, you'll try to make some arrangements to do the additional testing and the clarification things you need to finish up that policy and procedure review. So you might look at things like CPE records. You might do a sample of staff for qualifications to verify that, in fact, these policies and procedures that they showed you in the manual and told you were in place in the checklist they filled out are actually there. Another thing that's going to happen on that first day is that the state audit staff are usually going to give you a little bit of an orientation training to try to get you familiar with how their work paper systems work, their networks, especially if they have electronic work papers, et cetera. As we mentioned before, sometimes a team leader comes in a couple days early and is able to have gotten some of that understanding already, so that person will be able to help you through the stuff. But they'll get you through all that important stuff that'll let you get through the nuts and bolts and get to work as efficiently as possible. They'll also talk to you about the really important stuff, like where do you find coffee, where's the best place to go to lunch, all the rest of those things. So you get all that knocked off on the first day, and then you're going to dive into looking at some of those specific audits that have been sampled. So on this first day, the team leader, your job at that point is going to be to really get things moving. You know, try to help everybody get going as much as you possibly can. You're certainly going to run that entrance conference when you first come in. You're going to take some time probably at that point to discuss any outstanding issues or anything that you might have with the state audit folks. If you've been there for a couple days before the team, you've probably got those out of the way, but if not, there may be some outstanding documents or things that you need or some clarification, et cetera. you might want to consider on this first day actually doing some of that compliance testing yourself, because there's going to be a lot of information coming in from the team members to you at this point in time. And so if you can take a look at the CPEs, the qualifications, stuff like that, if you've got the time to do that, that may free up your team members and allow them to get started on their audits quicker. So you'll consider whether you want to do that. But again, not much different than running a regular audit that we do back home. Not a lot of stuff coming to the in-charge on the first day that you're there, and so you can kind of jump in and help a little bit. But the important thing that you need to do during this first day is to really try to carve out some time, spend some time with each of the team members. Make sure that they're getting started on their first audits. Make sure they're comfortable with what you expect them to do. Make sure they understand their way through the work papers, et cetera, and that they're rolling and moving along. And you also want to try to plan some time at the end of the day as well to sit down and have a little status meeting. So everybody on the team can all understand where the others are, what they're finding, how they're progressing through the thing. That's going to help the individual team members judge their own performance and really try to adjust things to make sure that they're in line with what everybody else is doing. As for the team members, you're really going to have to complete that review guide for each of the sampled audits that are assigned to you. And we showed you that a little bit before. Your purpose here is to ensure, by looking through these audits, that the teams are actually complying with all those policies and procedures that you guys have just finished reviewing. So hopefully you're already going to be familiar with using these materials a little bit through your policy and procedure review and by reading each of those audits that have been assigned to you before you arrive. As we suggested also, you may even have this guide partially filled out because you've gone through the whole audit report checklist after you've gone through and read it and made sure that the content of the report includes all the things that the standards require, et cetera. But as a little refresher about those guides, there's a different guide for each type of audit, and each of those guides covers all the phases of a traditional audit. It starts with the planning, and it runs all the way through the reporting. So in addition, each of the questions on there is cross-referenced back to the applicable audit standard. It gives you a little bit of easy reference in case you need to look something up or in case you need to go and clarify what a standard specifically requires. So if you look at this one, here's an example again of that review guide. And the content here is not important. But what you really got to notice is that you get to answer yes, no, or NA for each of the questions, and you need to list some comments out on the side if need be. So you're going to review, each of these are organized by the individual standards, and when you look at this in detail, you see at the top, the standard itself is really detailed up there to tell you what the requirements are, and then that's translated into specific questions. So in this case, the first question talks about whether the written report contains the following items, and then it lists items, A through E, and continues on from there about things like the word independent in the title, whether it's addressed to the right person, et cetera, et cetera. So you'll have gone down through and checked all these off, and as long as they're yeses, then everything is fine. As soon as it's a no, then you're going to have to do something else with it. So you need to go through your audits. You need to answer as many questions as you can based upon your review. But if you get stuck with something, it's time to seek some clarification from the state audit staff that have actually done the audit. They're usually going to have the audit manager, supervisor, whatever they happen to call it in the individual state, there and available and pretty much at your disposal to answer questions about anything to do with that audit. They certainly want you as a reviewer to be able to go through that, to be able to see what was done and to be able to follow it. And if you're having any kind of difficulties at all, they're going to be there to help you. They're going to be there to walk you through something. If you ask them a question that they're not really certain of to start, or if they need to follow up or research a few things or call somebody else in, that's fine. Give them some time, let them go do that, start on your next review. But at the end of all this, in general, anytime you find yourself checking a no on that checklist, you should prepare what's called a matter for further consideration form. And that's so all of our individual exceptions can get aggregated, rolled up, and considered by the whole team at the end. Now this is, again, what that form looks like. The left side over here gives you some referencing. It goes back to where you found the problem. What was the question? What was the standard that it related to? On the right side, it lets you start to put in your opinion as to whether you think this is a problem with the implementation of the system, in other words, they had policies and procedures in place, but somebody didn't comply with them, or if it's a problem with the design of the system. There wasn't any policy and procedure in the first place for somebody to follow, and therefore this didn't get done. Plus, way out on the end, it gives you an initial assessment of whether you think that this is something that's going to be material. Whether you think at this point when you're writing this down, this is something that you want to think about either having some type of a quote reportable condition, or something that might even cause you to think about modifying your opinion. The final column, way out on the right, that's reserved for the ultimate disposition of what's going to happen, and we'll get to that later as we talk about how you make the final decisions for the review. But these matters are generally traceable back to some specific question that's there on the review guide or on the policy and procedure checklist. They can relate to that design and compliance, and ultimately you may decide that these things are going to get dropped because you've learned something different as you get to the end, or you've decided it's not material. There might be something that you want to discuss verbally with management, but not really include as part of any kind of written comment. Or they might be something that turns into a formal finding or something considered in formulating your opinion. Again, a lot of parallels with what you do every day when you're out there doing a regular audit and you find various exceptions to certain things. Okay, so that kind of gets us through day one. Now we're getting to day two, and day two kind of starts all over again. The team leaders, once again, your real job is trying to keep everybody on track. You need to stay ahead of those MFC forms as they start to get developed by the people that are reviewing the individual audits, and you need to get prepared for the rest of the paperwork that's going to follow for this. One of the things that starts getting done on day two, if we're looking at the short review, is you're getting a package ready for that concurrent reviewer, because that person's going to show up and be there the next day to start looking through some of the stuff. As far as the team members are concerned, you need to start discussing those outstanding issues with the audit teams, talking to them about any kind of clarification or additional information that you need. But you need to focus on getting things wrapped up as quickly as you can. If you're starting to have problems, talk to the team leader, talk to the other team members. You know, communication within the team is one of the best things that helps you keep moving forward. Talk to other folks about whether they're seeing the same things, encountering the same situations, and how they're handling. And importantly also, listen to what the others are finding as well, and start to think about how you can adjust your work plans if you need to. Most importantly, as you go through this day, you need to remember, you should be reviewing your second audit by the end of the afternoon. For the new folks, this is really the biggest surprise that folks find. Remember, you're not supervising this audit and signing off on all the work papers. You're in here to test somebody else's work, and so it's going to take you, you should be spending less time on being able to do it. If you're not on this second one, you're likely starting to get behind at this point, and you may need to adjust your emphasis accordingly, reduce the number of things that you're taking a look at or the depth that you're looking at. By the time day three starts around, they all start to run together for you. Everything is the same day after day here, but the good news is that the end's in sight. The concurring reviewer usually shows up today, and he'll want to discuss the progress and the issues to date, as well as to review some of the work papers and test some of the MFCs back to the review guides to make sure that everything has been carried forward properly. A team leader who's got things well prepared is going to have that package all ready so the reviewer can do this, and then the team leader can also start then at that point doing whatever they can to help the individual team members begin to finish up. From the team member standpoint, by this time your first audit should be done, and your second audits are all but completed by the end of this third day. If you've got 3 audits to review, you had that many selected for a short review, you should be well underway with that third job by the time the afternoon comes around. By now, you should be able to key in on any areas where you think you want to focus your examination, either because of some weaknesses you've encountered before or things you've heard others discuss. But your goal here is to assess whether problems are really isolated or whether they're pervasive. That's going to make a big difference when you start looking at your conclusions at the end of the job. So if you've seen some things once, you want to be looking at another job and see if you see it again, or if the issue that you saw the first time might have just been a random error. So otherwise, on this third job, you need to key in on these major segments of the audit, and you need to not worry if you can't look at every single thing for this audit before you get done. You need to focus on the things that you think are important. Okay, by the end of the third day, you should all be sitting down as a full team and discussing what you found. You should have a good idea at this point if there's any issues that anybody thinks are significant and whether anybody thinks you should consider modifying your opinion at all. Mostly, though, you should be able to come up with a collective plan that's going to let you get everything done tomorrow by the end of the fourth day. Day 4 is really when the things get wrapped up for you. For the team leaders, those MFCs have been coming in from all quarters, and the team leader needs to get them all fully sorted and organized for discussion later in the day. That means these things start to get accumulated by multiple comments that are coming off of the same question from different review guides, or multiple things that might come from different questions but seem to relate to the same issue or the same standard or the same type of consideration that you're going to want to try to guide the team into talking about. If there's any reviews that are still underway at this point in time, the team leaders are really going to be helping the folks get them done by the middle of the day. You're going to need to have their results in your hands, so you're going to have to work with them to be able to get them finished. In the afternoon, it's really time to close those reviews down, time to lock the doors and have a little team discussion where you sit down and you walk through all those MFCs. Each person who's written one of those is going to have a chance to sit down and talk about what they saw, what they observed, and it's time to really listen to what everybody else's issues are and concerns and decide on which ones of those items you think need to move forward and what that report's going to look like. For the team members, this is where you need to get all your stuff done in the morning. If you're already done with your own work, all your reviews are all finished, start looking around for how you can help others on the team wrap up their work. If everybody else is all done, or you can't help somebody else, then start thinking about how you can help the team leader get things organized. Organizing those MFCs, starting to formulate a plan for that meeting in the afternoon. As far as that afternoon discussion, everybody ought to be prepared to discuss the MFCs that they wrote themselves. Your opinion might have changed since you wrote it because you might have learned more, etc. So when you start that discussion, you may decide that you want to clear the item if need be. You might decide that I really don't think this is an issue anymore. Otherwise, again, you want to focus on significance and pervasiveness. Is this problem material? And is this a problem that happens over and over again? Or is it something that just happened once and it's a random occurrence? When you sit down and have this discussion in the afternoon, everybody should remember, now is the time to make sure that your perspective gets heard. At the same time, you need to remember that you need to work towards consensus. That's our job there, to come to a collective opinion. And there's more than one way to comply with a standard. So you need to make sure that you're open for everybody else's opinions and you consider things appropriately. By day 4 at the end of the day, you're going to decide on the form of the report. And in just a second, Staci's going to talk a little more about that. She's going to walk you through the real mechanics of how you determine exactly what opinion you're going to issue. So really, to wrap up our tour this week, though, it's sufficient to say that once the decisions are made, the team's going to need to complete some relevant conclusion documents that are included in the peer review manual and become part of the work papers and then draft up a report. If the team's considering modifying the opinion in any way, in other words, giving anything but a clear pass opinion, then the team leader and the concurring reviewer are going to consult with NSAA and possibly the peer review committee as well. After that, you'll want to give those state audit officials a general heads up on what they should expect to see at the exit conference the next day. And on that day 5, of course, that's going to consist primarily of your exit conference. You're going to sit down in the morning, discuss your conclusions with the state audit office and usually all their management team that they bring in. The team leader is going to run this exit conference, but if there are a number of items that you've come up with to talk about, either in terms of actual findings or in terms of just verbal comments, everybody on the team can expect that they're going to get assigned some area where they're going to take the lead in that discussion. And like any other audit we do, you need to make sure when you have this exit conference that you take a little time to point out some of the good things that you saw as well as the things that you might think needs improvement. That always goes a long way. And now at this point I'm going to turn over to Staci, who's going to walk you through that process of how we come to a conclusion after all the work is done. Staci?
Okay, thanks, Don. John basically took you on a whirlwind tour, and like he said, now I'm going to be the mechanic. I'm going to walk you through all the mechanics. I'm actually going to take you back a step in the process to when you're having that meeting to discuss the type of report to issue. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the forms and tools that are available and discussing the types of review reports and the circumstances when each is appropriate. So back to this slide. Basically, how do you decide the type of report to issue? Just like in auditing, judgment is something that you rely on heavily. You have to rely on judgment when determining the type of report to issue. And you take into consideration things like the nature, causes, pattern, and pervasiveness of the issues that you've noted. So how severe were the issues? Did they occur on multiple engagements? Were they with the design or with compliance with the system of quality control? And you're also determining basically the relative importance of this when taking into consideration the system of quality control as a whole. John touched on this a little bit in some of his closing slides there, where one of the things that I think is the beauty of the NSAA program is that you have reviewers from multiple states. You have a team leader and concurring reviewer that have been on multiple engagements. So you have a lot of experience there. They've seen a lot of different things in the review. So it's not one person's opinion that goes into the process of determining the type of report to issue. It's really a collective approach. And I think the point he made about making sure you're speaking up during this process is a great point to make. One other thing that I'll bring out is that normally by the time you get to this point where you're having your meeting, you normally already have a pretty good idea about the type of report that you're going to issue. So you're all usually in a room together. You're comparing notes during the week. So you know whether or not similar issues have been noted on other engagements that are being reviewed. In the manual, there's some great tools that are available. I think all of these on this slide here have already been at least spoken about on previous slides, but I'm going to go into to once again get into a little more of the mechanics of them. There are basically three main forms for using, besides the checklist themselves, but in evaluating results. There are three main forms that you use, and that's the MSC form, which I know John's talked about, the conclusions document, and the findings for further consideration, or FSC form. The MSC, just to briefly recap what John already brought up about that, you're basically filling this out throughout the review process. And this is where you're indicating issues that you've already noted throughout the process. The conclusions and FSC forms are more wrap-up documents, so you're filling them out here at the last, toward your day 4, after you have your meeting and make some decisions about the type of report that you're going to issue. The conclusions document is where you document your conclusions. No surprise there. But in a little more detail there, it basically is where you make overall decisions about whether or not their system of quality control has been adequately designed and whether they're complying with it, and whether or not some of the MSC items that you may have noted, whether you're going to carry them forward as either a finding, a deficiency, or a significant deficiency. The FSC form is where you would document findings that you've decided don't quite rise to the level of deficiency, but they're still things that you feel are important enough to report to the organization. I do have examples of these forms a little bit later in the presentation as I'm wrapping up, and so you'll be able to see what they look like. Another great tool that's out there for use is the reporting matrix. I know some effort went into, I was on the peer review committee when this tool was developed, and I know some effort went into it, and I think it's a great tool to use in evaluating results. I think this has already been said in the presentation too, but the peer review manual, the section on dealing with deciding the type of report, is also a great tool to use during this process as well. And now I'm going to play around with the little tools here. And this is actually an example of the reporting matrix. And It basically is taking you through, walking through different categories of findings and getting through whether or not, taking you all the way over to whether or not it's going to impact the type of peer review report that's issued. So this far left-hand column here is where you've got different categories. So you have things that are basically just going to stay on the MSC form. They're not moving any further. You have some things that would be elevated to a finding. And then yet again, you have things that would become a deficiency or a significant deficiency. And what this form does is it basically, I talked about the different things you have to consider, like the nature, cause, pattern, and pervasiveness. So these middle columns here are basically walking you through those decisions and those different factors and determining whether or not these items that you've noted fall into those categories. And so you're looking at the severity of the issues, whether or not they deal with the design or the compliance of an audit organization complying with their system. Then you get over to looking at the types of standards, how many standards were involved and how pervasive, so how many engagements were these issues noted on. Then you have your column where you deal with your overall decision in terms of whether or not the overall design and compliance was sufficient. And then that leads you to the type of peer review report. And I'll talk about these classifications and categories in a little more detail as I move through the next couple of slides. So the types of peer review reports, they're pass with deficiencies, and fails. Seems pretty simple on the surface, but we all know that getting to that point is not always so easy. One thing that I'll mention here, because I love to throw in facts, these report categories have been used since July of 2013, so they haven't been around this particular format for that long. The AICPA had changed their peer review reporting process, and I think it was the 2011 edition of the Yellow Book also went to these categories, and so NSAA adopted them as well. Now I'm going to walk you through each of the categories. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the pass, a report with the pass that's categorized as a pass. And so as you can see on the slide, that basically you're saying when an organization receives a pass rating that overall that their system of quality control has been suitably designed and they're following it. So you're basically saying they have good policies and procedures and they're following them on their audits. You may have noticed I put some emphasis on the word overall, and that's not just my southern accent coming out. Basically, I wanted to put the emphasis there so that I could come back and say, hey, we're saying this is an overall analysis, and so it doesn't mean that everything's perfect. There could be issues that have been noted throughout the review that would not be raised to the level of requiring a modification on the type of review report. So that's something that's important to note when you're making the decision about what type of category, what type of review report to issue. And this next slide will demonstrate that. So basically, to get a pass rating, you'll see with the design of the system of quality control, it's overall adequate, but it could be inadequate for parts of certain standards, one or more standards. And the same goes for compliance. So you're saying overall it's sufficient, but there could be areas where you've noted that it's insufficient. As far as severity goes in the pass category, it can range from insignificant to moderate. And you may only have noticed this on a few isolated engagements, or it may be more pervasive where you're seeing it on multiple engagements. And at the point where you're moving in severity from insignificant to moderate and you're seeing it on more engagements, this is where you'll move from just it being a verbal on an MSC form to it becoming a finding that you would carry forward to an FSC form. One thing that I'll make note of here is that most audit organizations review pass ratings, do receive pass ratings on their reviews. So overall, this is the most common type of review report issued. So coming back to our reporting matrix, basically I want to highlight how you would work through this reporting matrix, because once again, this is a very valuable tool to use during this process. And so everything that I had on that previous slide basically is coming directly from this reporting matrix. So you can see items here that basically stay as an MSC form, so things that would be more verbal recommendations. You can see that in the severity column, that they're primarily isolated or insignificant in severity. And overall, you're still saying that the entity is complying with professional standards. In terms of compliance overall, once again, you're saying it's sufficient. Here you're saying, hey, there's at least one standard or parts of at least one standard where there have been some issues, either with the design of the system quality control or with compliance. And typically this is only occurring on one or a few engagements. So you can still conclude that the system is sufficient to ensure that all applicable standards have been met. When you move down to this next row, these are things that would be a little more moderate in severity. You're still making the overall assessment that the system is designed overall well and that they're complying with it overall. However, there are certain parts there that they haven't complied with for at least one standard or more. And then here's where you're getting to saying that it's a little more pervasive, where you're seeing it on multiple engagements. So once again, you still have the pass rating, but you're saying there are certain findings that that are a little more significant than things that would just be left on the MFC form. I did talk to the NSAA staff and ask about how often they see FFC forms on the reviews. And so far, since they've been using the new reporting process, I think I counted there were approximately or close to 30 reviews, and 8 of them had at least one FFC. So that's a little bit more than a quarter of the reviews. So you are seeing this on a little more regular basis than you'll see when we get into the deficiencies and significant deficiency categories. Next type of report I'm going to cover is pass with deficiencies. So with pass with deficiencies, we're still indicating that their system of quality control is suitably designed and that they complied with it. However, you have that except for language in there. And so you're saying there are one or multiple deficiencies with the system, and that it's either that the system wasn't adequately designed or they're not complying with that system. So they may have, it could be a case where they're missing some policies and procedures for dealing with an area and therefore have not met standards in that area. Or maybe they didn't follow their policies and procedures. These types of reports are pretty rare since going to the new format. Only one report has been issued that has a pass with deficiency rating. So this is something that's not occurring that often. So at what point does an item rise to this level? You'll see here where you start to see some differences from where you were with the pass report. And under the design, you're still saying it's adequate overall, but it's inadequate. But you're saying it's inadequate for substantially all of one standard or parts of several standards. Similar with compliance, that you're still giving that overall thumbs up, but you're saying that it's insufficient for one part of a standard or parts of several standards. On the severity level, you're continually to move up here, and so now you're saying, hey, these are serious items that we're noting. So you've raised your level of severity. And similar to things that would result in findings, you're saying it's more pervasive and recurring. You're seeing it on multiple engagements. While I don't have a screen print for this particular section, this information, once again, is coming pretty much directly from the matrix. So it works the same way in terms of working from the left side to the right side and evaluating the issues that you're noting. Now coming to the dreaded fail category. I know before the webinar started, we were all talking about how we're getting ready to have our reviews, and so certainly none of us want to be in this category. And so I think that's why, as the reviews are coming up, we start to get a little nervous and anxious to have them done. But basically, there are 2 reasons for issuing a fail report. And the first one's on this slide, and basically that's that there are significant deficiencies with the organization's system of quality control. The second is basically, in dealing with the design, excuse me, back on that first slide, that's dealing with the design of the system of quality control. On the second slide, the second reason for issuing a fail report is saying that there are significant deficiencies with the organization's compliance with its system of quality control. So in this one, they may have policies and procedures, but they're not following those policies and procedures, and there have been problems noted with their engagements as a result of that. So what does it take to get you into a fail? Basically over here, you're seeing now we've progressed, and we're saying, hey, either the design is inadequate because, here you're saying there's several standards where it's been inadequate to provide reasonable assurance. Same thing with compliance, that overall it's insufficient, and there are several standards that have not been followed in this case. So it could be either or both in certain circumstances that could result in that. Your level of severity now has gone up to severe, and so you can see that each time it's elevated. And once again, you're seeing this on multiple engagements. So far, under the new rating system, there have been no audit organizations that have received a fail rating. So if passed with deficiencies is rare, this is even rarer. In fact, when I was talking to the NSAA staff about this, they said they were only aware of one audit organization that have received the equivalent rating under the old system, which would have been adverse since they had been involved with the process. So once again, it would be very, very rare to get this type of rating. And that's because state audit organizations, we've been undergoing peer reviews for a long time now, I think since the late 1980s. And so if there were problems that existed prior to that, they've had a lot of time to go in and work on those. And the types of problems that will result in fails would have to be very severe and more systematic in nature. And so therefore, things like implementation of new standards are really not likely to cause issues that would result in a fail because they would not be, they typically would be dealing with one standard or certain parts of a standard. And so now we've gone through the types of reports and some of the tools that will help you determine the type of report to issue. I'm going to circle back around and show you some examples of the conclusion document, because at this point this is where you're doing your documentation in the FSC form. Like I said earlier, the conclusions document is basically where you're evaluating matters and documenting those that are going to become either become a finding, a deficiency, or a significant deficiency. Here is an example of the form here. So this first question here is where you're evaluating, and if you don't have any issues that you're going to carry forward as a finding or a deficiency or significant deficiency, that you would check off and say everything looks good. And the second section here, this is for items where you're taking the MSCs and you're saying, hey, these are things that we're not going to either clear or we think they should be more than just verbal. And so you're filling in your MSC number, you're giving a brief summary of the matter, and then you check off whether or not it is going to be a significant deficiency, which would result in a fail, or a deficiency, which would result in a pass with deficiency, or a finding that would be on the FSC form. And basically, if you look at this language that's up in this section here, once again, it's coming from the reporting matrix. So we've been consistent in developing the tools throughout to use the same terminology and same descriptions for the reporting implications. And one thing I will note, you'll notice here this says GAGAS General Standards. So there are multiple conclusions documents depending on the different standards and different parts of the standards that you're reviewing. The findings for further consideration form, or FFC, we've already said this is basically where you take those findings that you don't think rise to the level of deficiency or significant deficiency, and you include them. And so it's things that you think need to be more formally presented to management and have them respond to them. They don't impact the report and are not a part of the reporting process, but do become part of the working paper, so they're carried forward to the next review. And this is an example of that form. And once again, you're going through the process of indicating where it originated, so what MFC form it came from. You document the standards involved, the description of the finding, the cause of the finding, whether it was dealing with the design or compliance, and the reviewer makes a recommendation in terms of addressing that issue. There's also a section here for the audit organization to complete, because they do have to respond to findings that are included on the FSC form. So this would involve their response, such as how they plan to implement the reviewer's recommendations, who's responsible for the implementation and the timing, and additional, providing additional information or additional procedures to ensure that's not repeated in the future is the last item that's in there. So we've basically gone through the process. You've heard about what happens on day 1 through day 4. You've done your evaluation of all the matters found, determined the type of report. The last thing you usually do on that towards the end there is you have an exit with the audit organization. John talked about that and what happens during that process. And so after you've gone through that process, you move on to the completion phase of the review. This is where you're finishing all of your documentation, you're finalizing your report, and you, at this point, one of the things that you should do is ask for the audit organization's response if they have a rating that is other than pass. So they'll have the opportunity to respond to the report, and that response will be included along with the report. Now I'm going to turn the presentation back over to John. He's going to lead our discussion on tips for a successful review.
Okay, thanks, Staci. Well, we're doing really good on our time here. We're almost to the end. So we got a few things here we tossed at the end, the tips for a successful review. We tried to put together these things that really aren't in the manual, but rather are some things that we've picked up ourselves along the way. Anyway, they're just a collection of small things that we found helpful. Hopefully you'll find 1 or 2 of them useful to you too, whether you're serving on a review team or whether you're on the receiving end of all this with the state audit organization. The first item is communication. I think every one of us agrees that a successful review depends upon good communication at all levels, both before and after, or before and during the review. That means communication between the team leader and the state that's being reviewed, between the team leader and the concurring reviewer, and the team leader and all of the team members, and also between the team members and the state staff when they get there and begin looking at those audits. Sometimes it's just plain better to over-communicate than it is to under-communicate, so please try to keep that in mind. Second thing is to avoid making any kind of assumptions. Make sure you don't walk into it assuming that people understand what you're talking about. You need to take some time to confirm that your communication is being understood. At the same time, you need to seek clarification when you think it's necessary. Don't assume people do things the same way that you do them in your state. Always remember that there's more than one way to comply with the audit standards. Ask questions and be responsive with your own answers when somebody asks you for a question. Reviews always suffer when people are afraid to ask questions or when they aren't responsive when somebody asks them a question. So for team members, talk to the state staff. If you're looking at an audit and you don't understand something or you can't find something you're looking for, ask. They are clearly there to help you to be able to walk through, and they'll be more than happy to do it. At the same time, if you're asked a question, try to respond as directly and accurately as you can. If you're not sure what the answer is, consult with the team leader or the concurring reviewer to make sure you've got the right response, but try to get back to people as quickly as you can. In terms of the state staff, the same thing goes for you. Ask questions of the review team, especially if you don't understand what it is that a team member is looking for, or what they're asking, what question they're asking, or why they're asking it. And of course, when you're asked for some kind of information or to follow up on something, please try to be as timely as you can with your response. Being prepared is always a big thing as well. Understanding the peer review process before it even starts is always helpful in making you better prepared for the review, making the review go better. That's the purpose of this training in the first place, to help team leaders, team members, and state office staff understand the peer review process so they know what to expect. And if you still don't understand, consult that NSAA Peer Review Manual as a resource for information. There's a lot of information in there. I think at the very beginning, Brad mentioned the frequently asked questions sections that are in there. There's just a multitude of information to help you understand what's going on. Second is to try to establish some deadlines, some timelines for the review, and try to stick to them. If there's delays on the state office end on completing and submitting those various materials, that's going to roll out through into the review. The same thing with on the team end. If you start to get behind on reviewing some of the audits, that's going to exacerbate and push that timeline out at the end of it. Reviewers also, before you get there, review the state office's website. Make sure you take a look at some of their work products. Take a look at it. They'll always describe up there what they're about, what types of work they do, and they'll have examples of some of their stuff. So even before you get there, take a look at this. There's a lot of background information. There's a lot of examples of financial performance audits. You'll really feel a lot more comfortable with their work when you start reviewing it if you've already taken a look through what's on their website. As you get down and start doing those audit reviews, here's one of the ways that you might think about approaching it. When you're reviewing audits, there's really only three things that you're doing. You're looking to see if the planning and the execution of the audit line up and if they meet the minimum standards. And you're also assessing the documentation that's retained to support all of those efforts. We talked about time constraints before, and if you're going to meet them, you need to have a structured approach to reviewing your sampled audits. Remember, these projects took these people hundreds, if not thousands of hours to complete. You are not going to be able to examine everything in just one day or even less, so don't even try. Try something like this to maintain your focus as you go through. First, make sure the findings and conclusions that are included in the report are supported in the work papers. Accuracy is the cornerstone of our profession. If you can't tell where statements in the report are coming from, or God forbid if they don't match up with the audit work, then you know that there's probably some bigger problems that you're going to have to look for. But this is the easy part. This is like setting out to look at internal controls and then just reviewing the control activities. There's a lot more elements to consider in complying with the standards and a lot more things you're going to have to do as you review the audits. So you also need to look at the foundation that the work's built on. Ask yourself questions like, what did they set out to do in the first place? Were the staff qualified and independent? How did they go through the planning process? Did they consider everything that they should have considered? How did they address things like internal controls, information systems, data reliability, fraud considerations? You'll find all these sections in that review guide. Pick out the ones that you think are the most important and study those. Your objective there is to see, can you follow your way through from the initial audit idea to the actual audit plan or audit program steps that were developed as a result of them going through and doing a survey and risk assessment. And then lastly, you need to look at the execution of that field work. Once that audit plan or program has been developed, did they actually follow it? Did they complete all the steps that were outlined? Did the results that they found from those tests properly make their way into the conclusions in the audit report? If the answer to any of this stuff is no, then you're going to be looking to make sure that there's a good decision-making trail in those work papers that you can follow to explain why.
John, one thing I wanted to point out with this section too is I know I was the person responsible for the CAFR in our office, and so of course every time peer review came, that audit was always selected in the review, and like you said, these audits, our CAFR audit is thousands of hours. It has so many different documents that are included. And so one of the things that I think is helpful for some of those larger types of audits, like your CAFR and single audit that have a ton of documents involved, is to sit down with the reviewer, or have the reviewer sit down with the project manager, whoever is assigned to kind of be their contact for that audit, and talk about where the planning documents are and where, you know, how certain information is organized that will help speed up that process instead of them just wading through all of these documents, because we all use different document management systems and have different ways of organizing our audit work. And so I always think it's good to get familiar with how things are organized and how they flow, because it really will help to go through that process of you know, working through from the end to inward, as you had on the slide, and being able to more quickly find the documents that you need to assist in the review.
Absolutely. Those are all good points. I mean, if you're on one of these reviews and you get assigned to do the CAFR or the single audit, it's a whole different animal in and of itself, and you will likely spend your whole time reviewing that one job. Okay, next tip. Important thing is to learn something. We've said this a few times, but it's worth repeating again. There's more than one way to comply with audit standards. You need to understand that although we all follow the same standards, we're not cookie-cutter copies of one another. There's a tremendous amount of variation among the offices that participate in this review program. Our offices are all organized differently, and we have different responsibilities and processes and approaches to completing an audit. This variation is what makes the peer review a valuable learning experience for everybody, both for the state that's being reviewed and for the members on the peer review team. The peer review process also needs to be value added. The state being reviewed and the review team need to approach this as a learning opportunity. You need to keep an open mind. There's a reason why we all have 2 eyes, 2 ears, and only 1 mouth. And it's usually better off, I usually find myself, I'm better off spending 80% of my time looking and listening to what others are doing and why they're doing it before I start telling them how I think something should be done differently. So ask yourself, is there a more efficient, more effective way to accomplish something? Is there a new technique or approach going on here that I ought to think about? Are there different perspectives that I need to consider before I start making some conclusions? Okay, by now you're probably wondering to yourself, how can I get involved on this exciting opportunity? Well, you've heard the commercial about join the Navy and see the world. This is more like join NSAA and see the states. Here's the basic things that have to happen. Brad talked to you before about some of the minimum qualifications for folks to be able to serve on the team. The biggest one of which there is that you need to really have 3 years of supervisory experience. And of course, you know, day-to-day work with actually supervising work, reviewing work papers, etc. There is a team member qualification form that's available online, and we've given you a link on here as to where you would get the one for the current year. But in that, you're going to put information on your background and experience, and that's going to help NSAA match you up with a review that goes with your talents. Now, this form is not something you do just once and leave it. We update it each year. So for next year, for 2016, you'd put in a new one, update your experience, etc. That lets them know who's still interested, who's still around, etc. Currently, there's about 300 people from the various states that have these qualification forms in for them to be able to pick from when they're staffing up a review. So 300 people, that kind of sounds like a big pile to get in with. So one of the things I want to tell you is don't get discouraged. But there's a few things to remember about the selection process. First is that signing up and filling out this form it just means that you're interested. It's not a commitment of any time for you to go any place specifically. You still need to get matched up with a review, and you still need to have your qualifications approved by the state that's going to get reviewed before you'll be tapped to serve. Another thing is, if your state only does performance audits, say, you're not going to be offered on states, or you're only going to be offered on states that do performance work. You're not going to get picked for a state that only does financial statement audits. Excuse me. Some years, therefore, there's more opportunities than others depending upon your background. For example, if you're a performance auditor, this is your year. The good news here is that there's 15 different performance shops that are getting reviewed in 2015, so there's a lot of opportunity. Another limitation is that there's really never more than one person from a given state who's going to be assigned to any review. And there's usually no more than one new reviewer assigned to each team. In effect, somebody who's never been out there on a review before. So you have a better chance of getting selected and sent on one once you've actually done one a time or two. So just because you don't get selected one year doesn't mean you never will. NSAA usually tries to fill the slots from states that have point deficits before reaching out to states that have surplus balances. Now those point deficits are in time credits. When you go out there and serve, your state gets credit for your time, and then your state draws on that credit when people come in and do a peer review in your state. So if you're in a state that likes to stay in the black, to have a positive balance in that time account, then your leaders are probably going to have to lobby a little bit to get people from your state considered. Because normally they're going to be going to look at people who got some deficits and trying to erase those. And that's especially true when you're dealing with new reviewers. So hopefully this has given you a little better understanding of what the peer review is like, and maybe it's piqued your interest a little bit about participating. Personally, I can't stress enough how much we think that you can learn from being involved in this process, or the value of the contacts that you're going to make and the new ideas that you're going to bring back if you choose to participate in this program. Personally, I've been on more than 24 of these reviews across 19 different states, including Alaska and Hawaii. Last year, I got to spend a week both down in Atlanta and in Nashville. And this year, I'll visit my 20th state by going over to the capital of Montpelier, Vermont. And maybe I'll probably get to 1 or 2 more depending upon how the schedule works out. But along the way, I've worked on teams with people from virtually every single state in the country. Experts in every single area of auditing that I can think of, from financial and performance audits to information systems and federal compliance. That means there's somebody I can call on every corner of this country if I need help with something. They too got somebody in New York that they can call as well. So short of professional certification, this is probably the best single course of action I've taken that's helped me to develop my understanding of our profession and to advance my career. I think it's a fantastic opportunity that NSAC has put together for all of us, and I, for one, can't wait to have every one of you join us. At this point, I think myself and the rest of the panelists will be glad to answer any questions you might have or discuss anything else that you think we might have missed.
All right, John, thank you very much, and thank you to Brad and Greg and Staci as well. Great job with the presentation today. We do have time now for questions and answers. We have approximately 15 minutes. Let me just refresh you on how to go about asking your question. Of course, today, as always, we're allowing participants to receive audio through either their computer or their phone. And to ask your question, please use the raise your hand function of our webinar software. Simply click on the hand icon that's located in the toolbar. And of course, if you're using your computer today and you want to ask your question live, your computer must have a microphone for that process to work. If you prefer, you can simply type your question and send it to us using the Questions tab located in the webinar toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen. So I encourage everybody out there to send questions that you might have. Obviously, you've heard from our panel today. We have an outstanding panel, lots of experience on a variety of peer reviews and types of reviews, and also all are members of the NSAA Peer Review Committee. So we have a wealth of knowledge with us today. I encourage you to take advantage of that and ask any questions you might have. So while we're waiting for some questions to come in, let me just get started with a few. Brad, let me back all the way up to you. You started us out on a good note, and you talked about the role that NSAC played and plays in selecting the team under the organization qualifications of the peer review team. But is there a role also that the state audit organization plays in the selection of the team leader, the concurring reviewer, as well as the regular team members?
Yes, Kenny, thank you. The state audit organization does play a significant role in that ultimately they're the entity which will approve all members of the team. And here in Ohio, one of the things that we try to be mindful of is the people that are being asked to come to our state, what their background and experience is. As an example, in Ohio, we don't audit universities. We contract those out to IPAs. And if a team were being formed that had people which primarily were university entity auditors, then from our standpoint, we would be communicating back to the team leader and to NSAA saying, we're looking for people with more perhaps local governmental experience as opposed to university-specific experience. Now, if you're a state that has a significant portion of your work in universities, then it would be appropriate to look at the teams and say, hey, we need to make sure we have people that have that type of experience. So really what we do, Kenny, is we try to make sure that the people coming to Ohio have a background that matches the type of engagements that we perform.
Yeah, very good guidance. Thank you, Brad. Let me go to Greg. And Greg, I've got a couple of questions here for you, really. They tie together, but it concerns percentage of coverage. And there's two different areas. You talked about the audit staff questionnaire, and you have to send out the audit staff questionnaire to a sample of the audit organization's staff. My question is there kind of a standard percentage of coverage? In other words, we send that questionnaire to all staff, 75% of the staff, 50% of the staff. Are there any hard and fast rules that you go by in determining how many staff questionnaires to send out?
Sure, thanks, Kenny. There really aren't any hard and fast percentages written into the peer review manual, either both for sampling audit staff and also for coverage of audit hours on the engagements. And I think part of that really comes back to what John was talking about at the end, in the sense that there's such variety in the states that participate in the peer review program, and we all are organized very differently, that to sort of come out arbitrarily with a set threshold or percentage, I think may really do a disservice to the value-added component of the review. And so where the peer review committee has sort of ended on this is to say, it really depends on auditor judgment. The judgment of the team leader and the concurring reviewer and the experience that they have to provide reasonable coverage. So, for example, with the audit staff questionnaire, you wouldn't want to sample all staff. We're not doing population reviews. But you might want to get a variety of staff at different levels of the organization. So maybe you do want to hit a couple people in the higher management positions who presumably may be the most familiar with the quality control system of the organization. But maybe based on your understanding that it's really primarily a lot of audit staff who are doing a lot of the day-to-day work, and so maybe you actually sample more of the sort of staff auditor level in the questionnaire, because then it helps you understand and get feedback about whether those staff actually understand their organization's policies and procedures. So there is a tremendous amount of judgment involved, but there are no hard and fast rules. I bet if you asked anybody who's participated on reviews, you're going to get a different response from every person as to what's the right number. So we keep it open, but based on judgment.
That's excellent, Greg. Thank you. I was going to ask you about the percentage of coverage on the state's audit hours, and you covered that. I appreciate it. Same answer. There is no hard and fast rule. It's really left to the judgment of the professional judgment of the peer review team.
It is, and there are guidelines in the peer review manual again, and I went through some of those in the sense of, if you have an audit out there that was a significant portion of the audit hours in the period, well, that's where the entity's efforts were. So to leave that out of your sample, you might want to have a pretty good reason for doing so. Staci mentioned the capper tends to always get picked. Well, that's because it represents a significant portion of the audit hours and risk to the organization, too.
Staci, I'm going to shift gears and go to you. I'm sure some of the reaching consensus and decisions within the team sometimes is not easy. What guidance can you give us on handling those tough situations where the team is struggling to determine whether a matter is, whether it should be cleared or passed, or whether it should be elevated to the FFC form, or just discussed verbally with the state audit organization? I know there's probably some tough situations out there. And then kind of related to that, what happens if the peer review team cannot come to consensus on the type of report to issue?
Well, I've heard arm wrestling and darts are good ways to kind of figure out who gets to make the decision. Just kidding on that one. But basically, there is a process that's laid out. So if you can't come to consensus, the peer review manual has a nice process that's laid out. You can do additional research, so delving into the standards some more, making sure that you have all the information that you need to make the decision. There are different resources that can be used too, so the team leader and concurring reviewer may talk to the peer review committee chair, talk to the staff at NSAA. There may be subject matter experts that can assist in the decision-making process. You may even need to reach out to some of the standard-setting bodies. I did check with the guys there, and I don't think this happens on a regular basis. I think a few times the peer review committee chair has been consulted on the type of report to be issued, but normally the team is able to come to consensus. If they could not come to consensus, then the matter would be referred to the peer review committee chair for resolution. And so the chair has multiple options as well for once it is referred to them. So if the team can't come to consensus and they basically give all the facts to the peer review committee chair, they can do different things like have a subcommittee of the peer review committee, have another concurring reviewer come out on site, or maybe speak to some other teams that have done reviews as well, and of course referencing the policies and procedures that are out there in terms of the peer review process.
Thank you, Staci. I'm going to stay with you just for one more question. If the report is passed with deficiencies or failed, the state audit organization being reviewed has the opportunity to provide a response to the peer review team's report. How long does the audit organization have to provide that response? And what if they're late and you're kind of butting up against the contract deadline? Any guidance there? How long do you wait before you have to put some additional pressure on the state audit organization to get that response in?
So you brought up a good point, and that's the deadline for getting it out. And so there's no stated time frame for getting it out, for getting a response back from them. Although all of the contracts are set up that the report has to be issued within 3 months of the on-site review. So the response definitely would be needed by that time. So I think it's good to make sure that you've talked through all the issues. To me, the problem with getting a response would be maybe if there's still some questions about the actual finding, or there's some discussion going on or disagreement with the audit organization. And so trying to work out and provide all the facts to them concerning the findings or the deficiencies or significant deficiencies that would have resulted in a pass with deficiencies or a fail report. And making sure that you're following back with them so you're not butting back up against that deadline, and making them aware that there is a contract in place that they've signed as well in terms of providing all the information that needs to be provided for the review.
All right. Thank you, Staci. Very good. John, I'm going to come to you. Staci just talked about what happens if the team cannot reach consensus. Let's turn that around a little bit, and I'm going to ask you, what happens if the state audit organization doesn't agree with the conclusions reached by the peer review team? I'm sure that must happen occasionally.
Yeah, you're right, but it only happens very occasionally. Like Brad was saying, or like Staci was saying before, I'm sorry, that there are the adverse opinions, the fails, things like that happen very rarely, and that's certainly where you might run into some kind of disagreement. But NSAA does have a process set up through the peer review committee where there can be an appeal done, and there can be some additional information that is put together by the state audit organization and submitted in. And in those rare instances, NSAA will reconvene the team to take a look at some additional information. And they may even convene an independent team to take a look at some of that information and then make a final decision as a result of an appeal as to whether the original opinion is going to stand or whether something's going to be modified. So there are processes for that, but thankfully they don't need to get used often. We're pretty good at communicating and of getting some consensus and getting some understanding between the teams and the offices.
Those are good points. Thank you, John. We do have some questions from the audience today. Let's run through these. I think we can get through them. We're almost to the appointed time, but really 3 questions in the queue. John, I think the first one, you discussed the timeline and what you should be accomplishing day to day. But the question is, for the larger reviews, in other words, the ones that expand over the weekend, do team members generally work over the weekends?
Generally, Kenny, yeah, a little bit of work gets done over the weekend. On most of the ones that I've been on, I can't remember an instance where I worked on a Sunday. But depending upon how you're doing, there's usually some work that gets done on a Saturday. Many of the teams I've been on would go in and maybe go in and spend a half a day or 3/4 of a day on a Saturday. But the nice part about the longer reviews is they are a little bit less rushed. Some of the 5-day ones, I've spent some long evenings in there trying to make sure we're caught up for the next day. So you can be sure that if you're on a 10-day review, you're going to get at least a day and a half off to see the areas around there and rest up for the rest of the week.
Yeah, very good. Those short ones are pretty rushed, that's for sure. The next question from the audience, and Brad, I think this might be for you. You kind of touched upon how team members are selected and those types of things. The question, though, in this case is how are team members evaluated for their performance on a peer review?
Yeah, that's a good question, Kenny. At the end of the review, the concurring reviewer and the team leader talk about the performance of each team member relative to their evaluation of the sections they've been assigned, the reports that they've been assigned, and talk about some strengths and weaknesses of each one of the team members and whether or not they feel that that's a team member which could be potentially recommended to be a team leader in the future. And so each member is talked about, and then a recommendation is made to NSAA as to whether or not to have that team member out again or recommend them as a team leader, and that's pretty much the process.
Yep, excellent. Thank you, Brad. Brad, let me stay with you. Another question from the audience. Are team members required to bring their own laptops?
That's an interesting question. I don't believe they're required. I'll tell you, obviously with electronic work papers becoming more the norm, usually what's occurred is if there's electronic work papers, a state audit organization will have laptops set up that will allow a team to access their own unique set of work papers. And most people, I'd say roughly half the people come out with their own computer because they want to connect back to their office and an ease of connecting back to their office. But it's not a requirement. Many people go on reviews without their own personal laptops. I usually take one just to make sure that there's ease in connecting back to my office on email, but it's not necessary, and usually there's access to computers through the state audit organization itself.
Yeah, very good. Last question from the audience, and Staci, I'm going to give this one to you to start, and maybe others can jump in with some guidance. It's a little bit more complicated question, but it goes like this. We stated earlier that the audits conducted or contracted to be performed by other auditors are not subject to the peer review. However, can you expand on what would be required or reviewed during the peer review if the audits or audit work is relied upon for an audit under review and the applicability of the group audit standards? So in other words, it's kind of getting to that point of, reliance on other auditors' work, and how do we test and rely on the quality of that work from a peer review perspective?
I think that would go back to what the state, you really should be evaluating the state's policies and procedures that they've established for complying with group audit. So if they're, and it's going to vary depending on whether they're making reference to the other entity or whether they're basically taking responsibility for that work. So you're going to see different things in the work papers depending on that. I know in our state most of the time it's making reference. So to me, it's all about, and we've talked about this throughout the process, making sure they've complied with standards. So what type of information would be required to be maintained to support that the audit organization complied with the standards, so that they have good policies and procedures for dealing with group audit, and then they've actually complied with those policies and procedures and have the proper documentation to show that they've complied with it. So I think it's going back to looking at the work papers and all the information that they've maintained to show that they followed those standards.
That's very good guidance. Anybody else want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, Kenny, this is Greg. I'll add, this comes back to the point of the peer review is to assess the audit organization's system of quality control. And so the focus is on the state audit organization, and that's why we say that those contracted audits aren't necessarily part of the scope of the peer review, because the peer review team is not going out and assessing that contractor's system of quality control. I think that's the distinction in my mind that's important from the peer review perspective. And that's why it goes back to Staci's response of what is the state organization doing to ensure compliance with the standards in these situations. Those outside CPA firms, they might have their own peer review over their compliance with their policies and procedures. So again, I think it's an interesting scenario, but coming back and remembering the peer review is about the state organization's system of quality control.
Yeah, very good. Good points. Thank you. John or Brad, do you have anything additional on that, or did we pretty well cover it?
I think those guys pretty well got it.
Okay. Yeah, I want to ask, I think those are the only questions we got from the audience. Let me wrap up with one more, and I may go around the horn on this one because I think it's so important, particularly for a team leader's perspective. But part of the challenge that we've historically had in peer reviews is getting peer reviewers to focus on the requirements of the professional standards and not how we do it in my home state. I kind of call that my state bias. what guidance or suggestions would you give to team leaders in trying to work through that my state bias and getting team members to focus on the professional standards? John, you want to start us?
Well, I think it's like one of the things I said partway through. Spend most of your time listening, and the smaller amount of your time talking. If you're really looking at this process as something to learn, you're going to realize pretty fast that there are a lot of different ways to go about doing something and executing something, and there is more to learn out there than you would ever expect. So I think if you kind of go out there with that focus, you might have a little this is how I do it at home on your first job, but that's one of the reasons why when a team gets set up, there's no more than one brand new reviewer out there. And after you've gone out and done this once and realized how much variation and how much difference you've seen and what those good ideas were that you brought home, I think you pretty much lose that attitude.
Good point. Staci, anything to add there?
I think that was a great point. And one thing I'll add is that if you feel that you're kind of have that bias creeping in when you're evaluating something, to go read the standard. And so I've actually done that, where I've gone back and I've read the standard, looked at what they did, and compared it to what was in the standard. So if you feel yourself kind of bringing that bias in about how you do something, then go and see what the standard actually says you should do. And if they've done it, then you pretty much, you don't have anything to say about, you can't say anything about it, other than maybe sharing ideas at some point, about the different ways people do things. But once again, that they've met the standards, and that's the main thing, and that you should be reviewing and looking at.
Excellent. How about you, Greg? Anything there?
One additional thing I would add, as a team member and even as a team leader, I kind of try and separate that question into two parts. The first question is, did they comply with the standard? Yes. Usually when I'm bringing experience from my state, or I'm working with others on the team who are talking about their state, really it's more of a conversation of, well, why do you do it that way? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? It's not really a debate or question about whether they've complied with the standards. It's about, wow, how did you arrive there? So I think if I can separate that question into the two parts, that helps me. The first question is, did they comply with the standards? Yes, they did. Then you can move on to the second one. Why do you do it that way? Maybe that's something I can take back to my state to consider. So I think separating those questions is a good thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. You can always, as John pointed out, you always learn really a lot on these peer reviews. Brad, anything else that the others didn't cover?
Well, I think they've covered a lot. I'd like to point out, John did say a number of times during his review that there's more than one way to comply with standards. And I think as a team leader, it's important early on to establish with the team that concept. And that is, we all have ways of adhering to standards that are built by our states and are appropriate for our own state organization. If we're a large firm, or I'm sorry, a large state organization, a smaller state organization, but other states might have difficult or different needs than we do. And I think establishing with the team that there is another way of complying with standards, and it's tough to take in the review week a thorough and understanding, particularly early on, of how they comply with the standards. So I think just going and talking with various people at the organization themselves when you have questions, and hearing from them what it is that they're attempting to accomplish, what the standard means to them, and what it is that their documentation is accomplishing. I would say that those are two things to add, which is establish early on that there's more than one way to comply, and to encourage people to go out and talk with people at the organization so that you don't have this, hey, they're not doing it right because we do it differently.
Oh, those are great points. Thank you very much. We are at the end of our webinar. Let's go ahead and wrap up. That concludes our webinar on the NSAA's peer review program, what you need to know before you go. I want to thank Brad and Greg and John and Staci again. Outstanding presentation today, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and experience with us today. And many thanks to members of our staff here who helped make today's event possible. They include Anna Peniston, A.J. Puryear, Sherry Rowland, and Kathleen Young. And one last thing, today we are using an electronic evaluation form in an effort to make our process more efficient. Immediately following today's webinar, you will receive an email that contains a link to an evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to complete the evaluation form and provide us your feedback on this training. It's very valuable information for us to take back to the peer review committee and to perhaps improve upon future training events for peer reviews. So please take a few minutes and complete those evaluation forms for us today. Hope you enjoyed today's webinar and found it to be very informative. An electronic recording of today's event will be available on NASAC's website starting tomorrow. So for staff today that didn't get to participate, you can refer them to the electronic recording. I think that's it. Again, thank you so much to our panelists and our speakers. Great job. I want to thank everybody for participating today, and have a great afternoon.